You're in the hands of an adolescent.
It's mystery. I don't like mysteries. Get bellyache. I got a duty right now.
Aye, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I am Urza Master. With me, as always, is Lord Uther, and today we have Judge Smales with us. Welcome back.
Spalding, get your foot off the boat. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. You're good. Glad to have you fellas with me tonight. Hope you're doing well.
Thank you.
Want to kick off the show by saying I'm very excited and was really looking forward to rewatching this film for this episode. But recently, I just found out literally a minute before we launched the podcast that AT&T and HBO Max's contract has recently ended. And I have spent the last 4 hours, roughly, trying to get my HBO Max login to work through my AT&T provider so I could watch the movie because it hasn't been working for a couple of weeks. And lo and behold, there's nothing they can do about it until the contract is renewed. So the HBO Max people apparently didn't know this when I was on their support 2.5 hours ago. But the AT&T people, after 2.5-ish hours, were like, oh yeah, this is why. And I'm like, okay. But I will say that the HBO Max people were okay to deal with, a little robotic. The AT&T people were actually pretty wonderful. I was actually having some nice back and forth with this one lady. She was very apologetic for the wait. And I said, hey, you know what? Back in the day, Blockbuster would take like 2 weeks before they'd have enough copies of the new releases out so I could go and watch it. And no joke, it happened to me with First Contact. I wanted to rent it so I could watch it at home. I don't remember. I was 9 years old at the time, and renting VHS tapes was my thing because we didn't have TV at that time. Sure enough, it took me 2 weeks. 2 weeks to rent First Contact, but I loved it. I loved every second of it. So it was kind of nice to reminisce a little bit and realize that, being on hold for a couple hours with customer support, it's not as bad as having to wait 2 weeks to watch your Star Trek movie that you love. So, Star Trek First Contact. I think this week, to change it up a little bit, I'm going to let Lord Uther bring in the scene here. Take us through the opening, walk us through the feelings we have as we enter this truly unique film.
You caught me completely off guard. So now I'm gonna throw it to Judge Smales. I'm gonna let him start it off. You threw such a curveball at me. Go ahead, Judge Smales. Bring us in. Take us out. Okay. However you want to say it in Trek language.
Okay. So yes, we have the 8th film in the Star Trek series, the second for the Next Generation crew. This was released 2 years after Generations. Now, the fans of the Next Generation cast, up until Generations, they'd been able to tune in weekly in season and catch up on all the exploits of their favorite Enterprise D crew. And now there's this gap, much like growing up when there was gaps between the Star Wars pictures or so forth. Now we have this sort of black hole. Like, what's been going on with them? What have they been up to for the last 2 years, et cetera, et cetera. And so when they returned from Generations, last seen being evacuated on the Farragut, suddenly we were in a whole different ballgame. Some of the same players behind the scenes returned. Some of them were new. We'll get into that a little bit. The first major change from any of the previous Star Treks. Star Trek the Motion Picture, you may remember back in 1979, that was rated G for all audiences, rated G. And in fact, yes, it was. And in later special editions, director's editions, so forth, they actually bumped it up to a PG so they wouldn't be the stigma of, it's a G-rated film. It's like a Disney picture. But when it went out into theaters, it was rated G for everyone. Star Trek's 2 through Generations, the remaining films with the original cast and the first one with Generations. Those were all PG, standard stuff, phaser battles and the like. This was the first to break the PG-13 barrier, First Contact. And the Next Gen crew would dip their toes into the PG-13 ratings twice. This was the first time. For, what was ostensibly a much darker, more claustrophobic, Star Trek meets body horror picture, if you will. I mean, and that was the joy of bringing in the Borg and so forth. I didn't realize this, again, not having been an avid Next Gen watcher, as it was going on. But the Borg themselves, aside from the Titanic Best of Both Worlds episode, and I think they were introduced in an episode called Q Who, and I think there was one more, maybe I Borg. I mean, for as much as people sort of have that excitement for them, they actually weren't in the show, constantly. I mean, they were sort of limited. They were probably referenced a lot. Thank God it's not the Borg, but they really didn't make appearance after appearance after appearance, if you will. So this was sort of a Valentine to the fans when Generations made the money it needed to make to justify the next one. Producer Rick Berman met with the writers of Generations, Brannon Braga and Ronald D. Moore, and Rick Berman said, "I want to do a time travel picture." And they countered with, "Well, we want to do the Borg, for the fans." Okay, well, we'll do both. We'll do a time travel picture, we'll do a Borg movie. And their initial drafts and ideas were much, much different than what ultimately ended up on screen. In fact,
really,
3 or 4 drafts into this project, they were thinking about the Italian Renaissance. That the basic setup was the same: a confrontation with the Borg in the present Stardate, and then when going through your temporal vortex, they would have actually gone all the way back to the dawn of true civilization. So you would have had Picard and Riker and them in full Renaissance garb and stockings and swords, and they had this whole different vision. And then they're like, nah, that seems kind of silly. So they eventually bumped it up.
It sounds a little silly.
Right. I mean, but that was their first thing. Oh, this would be great. Picard could be dueling with a Borg in Venice on a bridge. I mean, anyways, and that just shows you how the development process works. They eventually decided to bump it up to the the late 20th century or 21st century, when after World War III, they reference in the film, and they made it about First Contact. With that, hence the title of the picture, and we'll get into more of all of that and how that played out. But that's where they eventually landed on it. As I said, the previous screenwriters, they worked on Generations, they worked on this. This would be their final contribution, to the film side. They were both working on the individual Star Trek projects, and I think what was kind of stands out now as a viewer, if you watch it now, removed 30 years from its release and so forth. They were trying to do Marvel. They were trying to do this crossover thing well before any Marvel was even in the game, and that is why we have Lieutenant Worf, who has by this point in 1996 has been on DS9 as a regular cast member for a season and a third. It's why we have the Defiant in there in the opening galactic space battle. It's why we have Robert Picardo cameoing as the holographic doctor in the picture. We've seen him on Voyager now for this is Voyager's second or maybe just beginning its third season. So they're doing this thing where in the moment, as someone who's been watching these shows and is watching the movie, it's great. You go, oh my gosh, look.
I
it's
agree.
The Defiant.
It is cool.
Yeah. It's Picardo. But now, as you watch it back and you're removed from that, now it just feels, it doesn't feel off, but it's just so obvious what they were doing back then. And it becomes even more of a thing with the next picture and even a little bit in Nemesis at the end there. Where they're kind of trying to balance TV, film, and it, like I say, in the moment it was really fun, but it doesn't quite land with the same impact now, 20, 30 years later. As I said, a very claustrophobic picture, and lots of dark lighting. Jonathan Frakes, the director, they say that he researched films like Aliens, which is very obvious in terms of where he was going with it. Jaws,
Yeah.
Blade Runner. Like there were just he was referencing a lot of modern dark cyberpunk, the look of the picture, and it does stand out amongst all of the Trek pictures, both original cast and next gen. Kind of for its look. I mean, everything is very shadowy, and there's the sequence when the Borg first come into engineering and start taking out the crew. I mean, that's straight out of any number of horror pictures that you've seen, moving through the corridors and something moves through the foreground.
Yeah.
What was that? Is anybody else here? And then, the other engineer climbs up the ladder. Are you okay in there, Paul? And then the camera rushes at her. Ah! So, I mean,
Yeah.
there was a lot of different beats. This was Star Wars. This was Star Trek horror on a PG-13 level. And, as a horror fan, I'm like, this is great. We get to see these characters kind of in this haunted house setting environment that, otherwise, that's not a note on the piano that they'd been playing before. So that was my initial impression.
Sorry, Urza.
That's okay.
I'm gonna redeem myself right now. It's funny you bring up the PG-13 thing, because one of the first scenes is this thing coming out of Picard's face, and I remember seeing, and I saw that in the theater the first time I was with Scott, and we were in the theater, and I remember kind of doing a little bit of like, I just really see something come out of his face, and it was even like bubbling underneath there, I guess like Alien, right, with the thing that's gonna bust out of his chest. Spoiler alert. But here, pops out, grabs onto his face. I mean, it kind of sets that tone right off the bat. And even again, kind of more that darker tone, like the part where Picard is standing, looking out the window, and the music is just blaring. And I love how Riker fades in, and you see his reflection. I just thought it was so cool. And was this Frakes' first directing?
So this was his feature debut. He would later go on, obviously, to do the next picture, and he also did a Paramount picture called Clock Stoppers. I believe he had directed for the series, but yes, this was the first time he was behind the camera on a big. They gave him about a $45 million budget, and a lot of that was with the effects for the Borg, because again, the Borg on television, the makeup versus the Borg on the big screen, they had to sort of
That's a
redo
good
that
point.
process.
Yeah.
And so it was funny because I guess they approached Ridley Scott, who was at this point post Thelma and Louise, but pre-Gladiator, because Gladiator, I think most of us can agree, is when he kind of started his ascent back into the A list of filmmakers. But people forget in the 90s, he was doing things like White Squall, and I mean, there was just some pictures where it just felt like 1492 Conquest of Paradise. Again, no aspersions cast, but Ridley was not exactly. They felt comfortable enough to approach him. Hey, do you want to do Star Trek VIII? And he said no. And then they approached John McTiernan, who had done Predator, Die Hard, The Hunt for Red October, and he also turned it down. And at that point, Frakes said, "Hey, these guys don't know Star Trek. I know Star Trek. I can do this."
Yeah.
Like, okay, great. Boom. So, and that's how he kind of got.
I thought he brought a nice touch to the film. Hey, Warp Core podcast fans, it's me, Urza Master of the Warp Core podcast, here to talk to you about DigitalEscapePod.com, our production company's website and host to Digital Escape Podcast and many others. Check it out for all your Digital Escape needs. We have lots of great stuff out there, from blogs, links to contact us directly, advertising opportunities, and more. Our website, again, is DigitalEscapePod.com. I always liked all the episodes he directed. I always thought they were some of the strongest in the series, especially watching them now. They definitely hold up better than some. Tashiar. But, sorry.
That really bothers you.
Sorry, Tashiar fans. I never liked her character, and I thought when they killed her it was such a relief. But when they brought her back later on in the series, I'm like, okay, this is cool. I can get behind this.
Yes, that was cool how they brought her back.
But, yeah, in this film, I remember very poignantly as a kid seeing the Borg tech pop out of his face. And of course, I watched not only Next Gen, but Voyager and DS9, and it was cool because that was kind of the first time any show had brought one villain into everything, and not just Q, but like the Borg too. So the Borg were all over these programs. I mean, they weren't like in every episode, but they reference it in the first episode of DS9. That's why Cisco doesn't like Picard, because when he was Locutus, you know, that whole thing went down. We'll talk about that when we get to DS9, of course. And then the Borg are very prominent in DS9, including my favorite character in that whole show, which is 7 of 9, for many, many reasons, but some are obvious. But, like, the first thing about this is, like, not only do you get to see, finally, a big, large-scale space battle, but it's the vulnerability, again, of the Federation, which they play up in Deep Space Nine big time. And, you know, I can't help but be curious, like, what if the Borg assimilated the Jem'Hadar? You know, I digress. But the power behind some of the sequences in this movie, I mean, it's very Jonathan Frakes. He really hits you hard with everything he's coming at you with. And he does it with, I mean, I have to be honest, like, a lot of the set construction, a lot of the way the scenes are filmed, getting ahead of myself, I'm so excited.
Yes, you are.
It's composed in a way that just, it grabs you emotionally, and it holds your attention in ways that a lot of sci-fi movies just don't do. You know, it flirts with darkness. It deals with not just the darkness as a literal, like, dark, hard-to-see scene, but, you know, the evil of the Borg, but also the humanity of the Borg, in a way, with the Borg Queen that we'll get into a little later. But, you know, the way that Data has adapted and become more human, but not human enough, although he is fully functional. Again, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And it brings Picard up against himself again, not just as he reflects on his time as Locutus and this regret, this PTSD he's going through that wakes him up in the middle of the night. You know, it's all of this wrapped into one big package of, honestly, probably one of the most human stories ever, a story of a failure who became an accidental success in Zefram Cochrane. And I think, you know, that is mirrored in damn near every character that's on the screen. Even Worf, you know, at one point you can tell he just hates the Borg, but he's having a hard time fighting him, and he's a Klingon. And, you know, he's dealing with his Klingonness in DS9, so anybody who's a fan of that picks up on that sort of process that he's going through. You know, and I feel like the whole scene where the Earth suddenly becomes Borg, and they're just, like, mortified. And the whole crew is just like, what do we do? And then using the chronoton particles and traveling back in time. And one thing I've always found totally fascinating is they go back and they figure out what date it is by the pollution in the atmosphere. They never give up that environmental messaging. And I love it because it's like in every time, well, based on the air pollution, it appears to be approximately 1984, Captain. Let's get some whales. But you know what I'm saying? Like, there's so many, like, throwbacks to older Star Trek films and, you know, concepts, and, like, I think Frakes is really about the fan, because I think even though he's a star on the show, he himself is a fan. Like, I feel like he acts like he's going to watch himself later and be like, fuck yeah, you'll lay the pipe, Riker. Which I've said I don't know how many times watching The Next Gen. And it explores, you know, the crew's relationships with each other in a lot of interesting ways that, I just don't think even the series really touched on as well. Like Deanna Troi getting drunk with Zefram Cochrane. I mean, that, to me, is still one of the best scenes I've ever seen with her in it. Because it's so fresh and exciting. And you'd think after all these years of doing this weekly episodic show with these same folks, what new ground is there to break? And dipping into PG-13, I would love to see an R-rated Next Gen movie. Like, you know, maybe I'm a fangirl here, but I really think they could do something with this crew now that they're older in a much more warlike way. They touch on it in Picard. We don't have to talk about that, but I feel like there's enemies left on the table, and I'm hoping Picard Season 3 does some of this. Enemies left on the table that have some real brutality that never quite got to play itself out. Not that I'm a violence junkie, but this is your first taste of that for Next Gen, is First Contact, and really the ugly parts of humanity that survived World War III, and how, despite all that, something amazing like First Contact can happen. And well, that's what I have to say for now. What thoughts do you guys have?
So
Good, Spalding.
To pick up on Frakes' direction, I mean, this thing, much more so, I think, than any film I can think of. You know, even the great ones we agree, like Khan. This thing doesn't have an ounce of narrative fat. Like, we are engaged with the Borg in a full-on Federation defense within the first 12 minutes, or even less. I mean, I didn't do the exact stopwatch there, but I mean, this is not a picture that's going to dawdle.
Quick.
And it hits the ground running, and it never flags, per se. They also did, and I would attribute part of this to Frakes' direction, and I would attribute a good portion of this to the writers again. They did a much better job. We talked about this last week. They did a much better job of structuring the story so that each character, even the supporting characters, I mean, again, the Picard and Data were always going to be front and center, and they are in this picture too. They're given the most emotional beats, the most screen time, what have you. But by splitting the team up and basically having Riker and Troy and Geordi, down on the planet doing that storyline with Cochrane, and having, Crusher and Worf and Picard and Data up on the ship battling the Borg, like it allows even somebody like, Beverly Crusher. We said, where is she in the last picture? And here, at least, she's part of the action. She's in several scenes. She's interacting, with the principals. So it's not like they kind of, as an afterthought, let's give her a sick bay scene and be done with it. So I appreciated that. I think that comes from Frakes, knowing, hey, I've got these great instruments here. Everybody has a different, note or chord that they can play. Let's take advantage of that in our interactions with each other, and give the fans, the full credit. Because again, we're not going to see these people every week. We're only going to see them once every couple of years. So let's give them that. I also want to call out the uniforms. On the previous picture, we didn't cover the uniforms in Generation so much. They were doing this sort of weird transition where some of the uniforms in the picture were from the Next Gen show, and some of them were the modified DS9 uniforms that were, on the show for DS9 at the time. And it was kind of a weird jump. Like sometimes they'd have the DS9 uniform, sometimes they'd have the other uniforms. But here they just said, we're going all in. You've got the turtlenecks signifying, yellow for Data, and Riker and Picard have the red, and Worf, and I mean they went with this really sort of purple, dark tones, and like we were talking about earlier, like it's cool. It's something we haven't seen, and then they spend a good portion doing the 20th century, civilian clothes down there, which were also well done. I think the costume designer Deborah Everton did this picture, and I think she did a great job. So those two things stand out as we like I say, we get into this pitched battle early. It looks like we've got the upper hand, and then suddenly the Borg spring this temporal vortex, and we've got to send it through with, as Lord Uther pulled out, a gorgeous new Enterprise, the Enterprise E, which got plenty of beauty shots, as I like to call them, swinging by the camera, engaging the Borg cube, going back in time. If you like shots of ILM models, this opening is definitely for you.
Well, so great point about the characters getting some even time. Plus, you're bringing in people like James Cromwell, Alfred Woodward. I'm looking to my right here, and they brought in Alice Krieg. I mean, I think I said her last name right.
Alice, yeah.
I didn't know if you had to correct me on that one there, Judge Smales.
I'll go
but yeah, but so they're in the mix too. And again, correct me if I'm wrong there, Judge, but Tom Hanks was wanted to be Zenfron, right? Wasn't there a conflict?
At one point, yes, he was supposed to be Mr. Everyman, which would have been only the second weirdest casting in Star Trek. If if Eddie Murphy had taken the Star Trek IV role that he was supposed to take, he was supposed to take the marine biologist that Kirk romances. That was supposed to be Eddie Murphy at the height of Eddie Murphy-dom, right? I mean, this is Beverly Hills Cop.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so he was going to play.
And he'd have to have a relationship with William Shatner.
Yes, and that in Reagan's America, that would have been crazy. No, but Eddie.
Now I'm gonna bend over. You just do whatever you do.
But that didn't work. I mean, it turns out whatever scripting they did for Voyage Home, his people got turned off or they got bored or whatever, and he went off and did The Golden Child, and you can insert your own commentary there if you'd like. But yes, Tom Hanks is Zephram Cochrane. James Cromwell is just coming off an Oscar nom the year before for VIII. So, I mean, again, attracting bigger names or people that we are now familiar with outside of Trek. Like, Alfred Woodward has had a long and distinguished career, terrific as Tiny Tim's mom in Scrooged, I must say.
Yes. Yes.
But I'm saying, now they've wrapped their arms around, we can bring people in that you've already met and recognized and enjoyed their work and put them in this universe, and we won't skip a beat by doing it. So yes, having those guys in there. Alice Krieg, I think that's how we'll go with it. She was quite slinky in a terrible Stephen King adaptation called Sleepwalkers, which I don't recommend you find. But if you've seen it, at least you can appreciate sort of her sensual qualities, and she definitely more covered up in this picture, but just equally lethally kind of like seductive and cunning and so forth. With her Vaseline skin and her red contact eyes, she was formidable. We'll get into her a little bit more later. But yes, getting back down to earth and then grounding it not in a reality that we're used to, but at least more. We've got people and there's campfires and obviously just sort of settlers and survivors trying to come together after a apocalyptic. 600 million dead, I think Riker quotes on the bridge. So at least now we, again, the audience are like the surrogates. Like, here is what we might expect if suddenly these people showed up with phasers and said that, there's a cybernetic race that's trying to enslave the Earth. You need to help us.
That's the one thing I've always found awkward about that is they're like in this ramshackle. I don't even think it's a town. There's like 5 huts there, and right next to it they're building a warp-capable ship. I just thought that was a little. I felt like the technology should have been a little different of what was surrounding that. Again, I think Urza Master knows how I am now. I kind of nitpick things a little bit. I'm sorry, but that just it didn't. That was the only thing that really didn't seem to fit, in my opinion. Was that.
You know what's really funny? Speaking of that specifically, when I was in college, I started writing this 3-novel series I was going to work on, and I had this concept of 2 opposing sides in a World War III type scenario. Didn't even realize that I was like picking sort of the exact same setup. Where like a scientist, except mine was based on like a time travel thing where they accidentally send somebody into the future rather than in a cryostasis, and then he ends up in a totally bizarre reality future where, I don't know, the story is very interesting. You should read it sometime when I finish that novel, never. But it's so cool because like the concept of that really isn't that far-fetched to me. The idea of there's this decommissioned essentially or abandoned nuclear missile silo, which there you can buy those. They exist.
Yes, they do.
And there are some that are still staffed and still like in service. So there's an idea there that if this is World War III, the technology's come far enough that if one was abandoned or forgotten in the course of a 600 million casualty war, it could be possible that there might be enough there, and through trade and bartering with these sort of warring Mad Max type factions, I've always thought that, this is somewhat plausible. It's a little odd. I think the bar is what threw me off the most.
Yeah, maybe
but
that
then
was
you
it.
consider who Zephram Cochrane is. He's kind of an alcoholic, dejected scientist. I would set up a bar too. I have a bar right in my basement here, for crying out loud. So I think there are dots that connect there. They're a little loose. I think that's maybe a thin point in the character creation. But I love the fact that it kind of brings to light the idea of archaeology in a way, where they've vaunted this person, like this Zephram Cochrane. Oh my God, he's my hero. Geordie especially freaks him out by saying, "Oh, you're standing in the spot of your statue."
I went to Zephram Cochrane High School or whatever. Yeah, great.
Exactly. So it's like it's this hero worship thing, and the reality is like he's just a dude, and not even like a good guy.
Right.
And it makes you think about the heroes of our day, and especially this is mid '90s, later '90s. Who was the famous explorer that everybody sort of in the United States of America, kind of idealized that really was a piece of shit? Christopher Columbus. I mean, it's the same kind of analog. We have all these statues of him, and then we kind of realize, this guy's kind of a piece of shit, right? Not to get political, but it's the same idea with Zephram Cochrane. He's kind of a piece of shit, but he does something really important that, discovering warp technology ushers in, a peaceful era by meeting the Vulcans, but it also inevitably leads to the Borg coming back and causing a crisis right after a world war. So, the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's interesting and an interesting parallel. If you think about the hero worship and the views we have on history, everything is a little revisionist, usually in favor of the victor.
Look,
and I would pick up on that one note.
Go ahead.
It isn't even so much that he's. I mean, yes, I agree with everything Urza Master said there, but it's that he hasn't done the things that they're worshiping him for, and it's like he spends a lot of that time like wrestling with this idea. You guys think I'm this mankind's savior, and I'm not that guy. I can't even imagine that I could be that guy. I can't manifest that reality in my own head. That's not something I aspired to. That's not something that I ever wanted to be. And yet you're telling me that I am the crucial pivot on which mankind will enter a brand new era. Like that comes through even stronger now as I watch it. Years from its release, I think I can relate to that theme of this idea of you're telling me this guy. I don't know who that guy is. It's not me. And then circumstance obviously. That's where it leads him, but it's a great character journey.
We want our heroes to be painted a certain way, right? I mean,
me and Brett Favre.
Until thank you. He's had a couple of issues, but you love him. He's your hero. Larry Bird, that was my guy, and he was not a good father to his first child. That's putting it nicely. So.
Spacey. Oh, no, just kidding.
That's a whole wow.
Now there's a cameo. Okay, let's talk about that. There's a cameo I always kind of expected to see in a Star Trek episode or movie.
Kevin Spacey?
Yeah, I always thought he was the kind of character actor who would make a fine Star Trek character. Whether he came in for an episode as a guest star or played the villain in a movie, because he played great villains. He also played great, interesting characters. Because I love the movie K-Pax. I'm not going to, rehab Kevin Spacey tonight, but I think K-Pax is wonderful. And that's a sci-fi movie. He always struck me as somebody who could be on a sci-fi movie like a Star Trek film. Not as a, cast member, but definitely as a, this is a diplomat from, Remus or something.
I see
he
it.
could have been a Riemann in Nemesis, but
I see it.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a piece of it, right? We want our heroes to be, and I always used to teach my students that history is, there's nothing neutral in history. It's always going to be someone's perspective, no matter what. And, my students would be like, well, in the book it says, I go, you got to be there. And I go, and even if you were sitting there watching what was going on, your view of it would be different from Judge Smales, like completely.
oh, 100%.
So that's that one piece. And now I'm gonna kind of tie the archaeology part to, you've got Data and Picard to humor, actually. So there's a lot of humor in this film too, which is something that I think is interwoven very well. Like the one scene where Picard is talking to Data about actually touching the ship, and I think that's so cool because I can kind of relate to that idea, right? To actually be able to kind of like touch history in a sense. And so they're touching and they're talking about it. And then Troy, looks over the railing and goes, "Do you want me to leave you alone?" And, ha ha ha, right? Like it was something a lot, right? So we're getting that humor at different points but you still have the action. Like you have this really great balance that kind of comes about with that too.
Yeah, I love that part of it. I also really, really enjoy how because I don't think we got this so much in Generations, but they give Picard his soliloquy, his Hamlet moment, where he has his breakdown and his come to reality moment, and that speech he gives on the line must be drawn here no further. Even the kind of well parodied moment, thank you South Park, where he goes, "No, no," and he just like breaks something. Like, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I just got chills now just thinking of that scene, and that whole speech, and then you broke your little model, and it's like,
yeah, and which one did he broke Enterprise D, which I thought
It
was
was
funny.
D. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And it just like I don't know the poignance. You could talk about how poignant this movie is. Like every single scene, it just grabs you by the balls and twists. And that's the one that really grabbed me. It was like, holy shit, this is some effing JLP right here. He's finally facing down his demons, and he's gonna get his damn revenge. If it kills him, and if it kills everybody around him, and then he realizes he has his moment that Hamlet never had, and it's so Shakespearean. He's just, no, you know what? I'm not going to do that. It's not going to be my white whale. It's not going to be my Uncle Claudius. It's going to be victory, and I have a plan. Hey, Warp Core podcast fans, it's me, Urza Master of the Warp Core podcast, here to tell you about Sanctuary Woodworking. Great craftsmanship over there. They make gaming tables, which are really unique. They double as a TV, but also can display your interactive maps for all your tabletop gaming needs. Games like Starfinder, D&D, and others. So if you need a gaming table, check out sanctuarywoodworking.com. Self-sacrifice if it must be. And if you want to talk about kick-ass moments, Patrick Stewart is not like this giant, ox of a guy that you don't want to get into a fight with. But you certainly you don't want to mess with JLP here. He's a strong figure, but he's never that, Kirk would kick your ass in a bar fight. Right. Jean-Luc Picard didn't need to. He would just embarrass you to the point where you wouldn't need an ass kicking. And that, I think, is just so cool to see a little bit of a mixture of both in this film. But it really comes in heavy with that sort of poetic justice. And then, of course, father and son moment as well with Data, where at the end, it's kind of like the son is growing into a man and has to make a man's decision. And he does it, Not only that, but he kind of becomes a man in the literal sense, too, or the sexual sense in a way. Where it's like, I don't know how many youths like me saw this Borg Queen interaction with Data and discovered themselves a new fetish, because holy shit, that was a very well played scene. And, I mean, you know, it's still the emotion chip. They're bringing something out there, but it's just they touch on every kind of 7 deadly sins in this movie. And I thought that was really cool. It's not only, like, titillating, but it's also poetic.
Hello. The Moby Dick... Hello again. The Moby Dick scene, I think, was on purpose. Mr. Judge, you want to jump into that? I mean, you're the one that told me the story, so that's how I know that. Wasn't he in the play on Broadway when he was? You know what?
Again, he did do.
I got to remind you of your own story. I mean,
yeah, you do, because it's been a while. I think he did it both on the stage, and I want to say he did it for TNT or something, that he may have done an Ahab.
Oh, that's what it was.
In the early 2000s, or yeah. So I mean, it was right there. I said this to you guys last week. I come to these movies to see Patrick Stewart yell at people, and I was not disappointed in this one at all. He's yelling at Worf, you know, get off of my bridge, you coward, and he's yelling at Alfre Woodard, and he's yelling at every. I mean, he's barking orders left, right, and center. So for if that's, you know, to pick up on Ursa Masters' thing there, that scene does give you chills. And then you have to go to, again, who's getting the next biggest storyline in here is Brett Spiner and Data. And, you know, again, it's an obvious, every critic in the world, even the ones that don't know Star Trek, you know, picks up on Pinocchio, wants to be a real boy. But that, to have just left it at that would have been a cliche. As I was rewatching this picture now, what struck me was, even though he's basically, you know, pinned down by magnets for, you know, 2/3 of his performance there in engineering, like, Spiner is communicating, you know, first as Data with logic and reason, then she activates his chip, and now we're seeing the varying emotional states of him played, you know, and then later when, you know, Picard enters engineering and all that, then we're getting a whole different shade. So, you know, it's one thing to overlook Spiner and what he was able to do, you know, based on where they, you know, how they had put him there. But he's doing a tremendous job, just basically, you know, pressed up against a machine in engineering and just talking these long, you know, dialogues with the Borg Queen. It's terrific. I mean, he's doing this master class in being able to communicate all of the different conflicts swelling up within Data. Because, you know, we want Data to get free and save the ship. But, I mean, at the same point, the temptation, right? I mean, he's out there in the desert and he's being tempted, you know, by Satan, saying, "Here, wouldn't you rather like this? Join us. And, you know, we'll use sex and we'll use power and we'll use everything you've been reaching for and wanted to evolve. We'll give you that, you know, just join us." So I think Spiner, like Picard, and like we said, whenever they conceived these movies and scripted these movies, those two were always going to get the lion's share of, you know, the meat on the bone. What I think Jonathan Frakes and those guys did was spread it out evenly enough so that we weren't feeling cheated or disappointed. But those two, I mean, they got their meat and they just, you know, dug in and delivered great stuff there.
This is one of the first time, and I haven't seen a lot of DS9, which I've kind of confessed that. Aaron did introduce me to it, but I didn't really follow through after we went back to school. So back to USC. I always felt like they always were talking that Worf was a badass, but he never really showed he was that much of a badass in Next Generation. And I feel like in this movie, he's able to show off some badassery. Like he's looking as big and as buff as ever in a sense. Like the makeup looked really good on him. His facial expressions were fantastic. He's shooting Borg over here. He's chopping off an arm over there.
Ramming
I felt
speed.
like, and the look that. What was that?
Ramming speed.
I mean,
Prepare
yes.
for ramming.
Yeah. There's another great example. Prepare for ramming speed. And when he looks in Picard's eyes, and he's like, "If you were any other man, I would kill you where you stand." Of course, I couldn't deliver as good as Michael Dorn, but like you could see the anger in his eyes and the rage. So I felt like Worf really, and I know we're talking about everyone kind of having their even thing, but I think Worf was pretty.
They treated him well.
prominent, right? Well, it really played to his strengths in this movie. To me, finally, I like how Riker ribs him when he first gets on the bridge. You know, nice little ship, little, right? You do remember how to fire phasers, don't you? And just the looks that Michael Dorn is giving, I thought he did a great job of this. Might kind of be the unsung hero of this movie now that I'm kind of thinking about it.
And
yeah, in a lot of ways, I think so. And it's interesting you bring up DS9 because he's a total badass in DS9. And that was a cool... Him and Miles O'Brien honestly really kind of made DS9 over the years. I mean, Quark and some of the other characters, Jadzia Dax and Kira Nerys, I mean, I don't even have to get into that. But Worf, especially early on, really helped make that series. And just was badass in how he brought that Klingon story in. And so when you see him in this movie, living up to sort of that battle-proud spirit, that, I mean, you get a little bit of that in Next Generation, but not nearly to the degree DS9 does. It was very freaking cool to see him fighting Borg in space in those gravity boots that everybody remembers.
Yeah,
magnetic boots, and with Picard. And then there was another cameo, the guy who gets Borgified out in space.
Neil McDonough,
Lieutenant Hawk.
Lieutenant Hawk, yeah.
Neil McDonough.
He's
Neil
been
McDonough,
on
yeah.
Justified, and he's done a ton of TV.
Yeah, so it's like, again, with the great cameo actors or guest stars, if you will, the casting was just flawless in this movie. I mean, I have to say, it's interesting because, you know, I tend to overrate things. My friend used to call it the Cody scale. It's like, so do you love it or do you love it? Because there's nothing worse than just loving it. And it's kind of true. I'm overly positive, but this was a movie that I think I can reasonably stand on and say I don't know that there's really a big flaw there, other than the thinness of like the scenery with how they set up Cochrane's lab and whatnot. But you know, aside from that, I really don't find fault with it. I think everything played out exactly the way it should be. It was interesting. It was potent and powerful. The one thing I think I wanted more of in this movie is probably more of Picard and Cochrane. But, you know, you take it or leave it. You can't give everybody all the screen time. I don't know. Do you guys... This is an interesting point because I think we all really like this movie. Do you guys see any like major faults or even any minor faults? I wouldn't say, other than like a small thin part like we talked, I don't see anything. I don't see anything with this movie that strikes me as off or not in the right place.
Yeah, I already brought it up. I mean, that was my only issue. I mean, they even start kind of bringing Riker and Troy together a little bit. Like you're seeing in the bar, you know, he's smiling at, like, that's a loving smile he's kind of giving her. So you're starting to see that possibility, I felt like. So they even were playing into that just a little bit. I mean, the rest of it, again, I agree. Just my whole issue was that missile that was in that area. That was my issue. What about you there, Judge Smales?
So this, and I have thoughts on Nemesis, which we'll get to when we do Nemesis, but of the 4 Next Generation films that they did, no one's going to mistake this for just a big screen episode on TV. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
This
next
was a movie
week on Insurrection.
That's great.
Like from the first moment that we come in, from the pullback from Picard / Locutus's eye all the way back through this giant Borg cube and its interior and back. From its themes, from its performances, from the effects, all of that, this screamed big screen, even ironically, as a lot of it, as I said, was very claustrophobic and done in dimly lit hallways. I want to give a shout out to the cinematographer. Last week we talked about John Alonzo briefly, who was the cinematographer, amongst other things, of Chinatown, doing Generations. This was Matthew F. Leonetti, and he worked for decades. And just some of his credits, I mean, some of them probably will last longer in the Hollywood Hall of Fame than others, but I mean, Poltergeist, Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Weird Science.
Oh, wow.
Jagged Edge, Commando, Action Jackson, Carl Weathers, Red Heat, Steven Seagal's Hard to Kill, which again is so much fun, so much fun. And then he had just come off of this picture. He had just done Catherine Bigelow's Strange Days, which is a very underrated picture, and that's a whole other discussion on that. But that's one that I happen to like a lot with Ralph Fiennes and Angela Bassett and Juliette Lewis, and the James Cameron script. But irrespective, again, bringing that look, and then bringing Jerry Goldsmith back fully into the fold. He would go on now.
Yeah.
And score the last three generations, this picture and then the next two. Rick Berman, the producer, he wanted him in. Obviously, they had used his theme for the show. And I thought, not only does that theme sound, right with this cast, with these adventurers, but, he had this beautiful opening credits, brand new theme that he did that he, wove through the entire picture. And he also, believe it or not, if you hear it, he took some Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. There was a theme that he first used in that film when they were, searching for the creature, passed on Shakari, when they were looking for God. There's a theme, musical theme that he played in that film, and it basically it shows up again here in First Contact, and then he uses it again for the next two pictures. So I mean, it was just, as someone who's into film music and so forth, it was great to hear him and bring that sweep, that heft. Pay attention. This is serious stuff. Also on the fun cameo side, if you're a fan of Apple TV Severance, or I think he was in Parks and Recreation. I'm not sure which sitcom he's been on. But Adam Scott is the defiant. Yeah. Adam Scott is the defiant officer who tells Worf that all systems are down, which prompts the famous "prepare for ramming speed." So if you go back and watch, you'll see Adam Scott saying, "Sir, there's another ship. It's the Enterprise." And it's just fun to, if you know who Adam Scott is, to see that one there.
This is it right there.
So again,
I
fun
forgot
cameos.
about that.
Yep, he's got a little.
We also get Reg's back, Barclay's back.
Yes,
I love that. Lieutenant Barclay's back.
Yes,
That was. I mean, and just does the whole goofy, like, typical. Yeah, I love that too. Just a typical Reg, right? Like, he's looking at Cochran, and Geordi's like using his. By the way, Geordi gets his eyes, right?
Yes, Geordi
gets the new eyes. No more visor.
Just, yep. And the thing about Reg.
So that was something I kind of.
I mean, the thing about that was, if you're a fan, you love the reference, right? You love seeing him, like, oh, there he is, and he's being twitchy and neurotic. But if you're not, if you've never seen him, the scene still works. Like, it doesn't, it just, here's a guy who's nervous meeting his idol. Like,
love it.
Like, it doesn't detract. It's not an Easter egg where you're kind of like, this is just for the fans, and the rest of you just sit there and scratch your heads. Like, that's, to me, when you do it right.
Yeah, and back to the point of no explanation. So not only do we get no explanation for Geordi's eyes, but we also don't get any explanation as to how Data can all of a sudden control his chip and turn it on and turn it off. No, there is no talk about, not even like a 10-second Geordi was in his head and manipulate, right? He can just control it now. So, and I always, I've told Urza Master tons of times, that's what I always loved about Star Wars. You didn't need the explanation up until Phantom Menace.
All right, we'll argue about that.
We'll talk about that one day.
I'm sure.
But in Star Trek, I always love how they explained everything, and they tried to give it some science. I mean, I was so into it at this point in time. I had the Trek manuals. I had a computer a computer library where I could access the cars and everything. I was deep into it. But that's because you could get all that technical background, and that was the one thing I always loved about it. But here, that's in this movie, nope, no explanation.
And you didn't need it.
I agree.
It was the beautiful thing about this film is, like, after what happened with Tully and Soren, you kind of assume, okay, they're going to have to do something about this visor. And then after what happened with the emotion chip, they're going to have to do something about this. So when it comes up, they did something about it. That's all the explanation needed. And I think it gets back to just how they crafted the movie. Is like, you don't care about those minor details because everything else has your attention. And everything makes sense. Like, there's nothing in this movie that seems convenient. It's really, truly a strain to defeat the Borg, as it should be. The Borg Queen concept is brilliant, makes perfect sense. It's a collective, but they need guidance. They need some sort of guiding force to keep them organized. Queen makes sense. Ties in, of course, with Voyager and DS9. They're bringing kind of all these loose ends together, so it's like, hey, this is still an interconnected universe. Keep watching our other series, please. And it's something that, when we talk about the later Star Trek films, or shall we say the non-canon Star Trek films, they don't have as much of. It's really just kind of trying to spin some of the same stories with a slightly off-level wheel. Not to say that they're bad, because I enjoyed them for what they were, but I think this is like Wrath of Khan, like Star Trek VI, like Star Trek IV. This is, and I would say like Generations, in my opinion, this is that movie that if you were going to tell somebody, go watch Star Trek, start with this. Start here. This is the best it gets. The rest is exposition for this, basically. So let's go ahead. Let's do our thing. Out of 7 warp cores, how many warp cores, Judge Smales, do you give it?
I think you really have to touch the heavens to get to 7. But I would say this is a strong 6. I would say, very few flaws. I mean, like I say, as you step back, the effects, obviously, they're 1996 good. They may not be 2023 good, and that's a very minor quibble, and I'd never hold it against him. But I would say that this felt like, and I think picking up on something you just said, Ursa Master, you can watch this picture, you could watch it cold. I could show this to my parents, who have never sat through a Next Gen episode and probably just remember the original cast from the 60s. They could follow this picture from A to Z and get what it was trying to say, and what emotional value and excitement they can draw from it. It's a completely self-contained animal in that respect. It's very respectful of and connected to the whole, but you can take this piece of pie, this slice, and enjoy it for exactly what it says, and not have to worry about, I should have seen the first 7 of these. I mean, it's a meal unto itself. So.
Look, any movie that uses magic carpet ride, like they all were using during the 90s,
Steppenwolf was making bank.
It's going to get 7 out of 7. I'm sorry, what was that there, Judge Smith?
I said Steppenwolf was making bank with the licensing, yes.
Yes. It's going to get 7 out of 7 warp cores. I get a buff Patrick Stewart walking around in a blue, muscle shirt. I get these glorious shots of Enterprise E. I love it. I get a space battle. Love that. But the one thing I get that's always been a complaint, even though they teased, and Beverly Crusher, it was very important she was there because she had to try to initiate a sequence. They didn't blow up my gosh darn ship. They didn't blow it up. So because they don't blow up the E, that sealed the deal for me. 7 out of 7 warp cores. This is my favorite Trek movie. I mean, Wrath of Khan's right there, but this is it for me.
Real quick question to you guys, though. Because it's the E, and because this is the first time we're seeing it, and we're spending a lot of time on the lower decks, and we get that great sequence outside on the dish. Like having the show go for 7 seasons, you kind of felt like maybe you could find your way around the Enterprise. Like I kind of knew where Picard's quarters
Yeah.
were, or where sick bay was, or the transporter room, or so forth. Like I said, like this ship will repeat in other episodes, but as you're watching this, like, do you feel like you got enough of like the ship itself, or like, did you like the bridge? Did you like, were there anything that jumped out at you in the sense that, like, oh wow, this is cool, or because we had stellar cartography in the previous.
That's a great question.
So I'm just curious, like, did you guys like the Enterprise E? I mean, yes, it looks great outside, but yeah.
That's a great. It's and we talk about the new uniforms. I feel like those uniforms belong on that bridge. There's a synergy that's happening with the uniforms. I like the nav and the con stations. It works. I think that's an excellent question. I love the E. And again, part of it is that inside where just a change in colors from the D, right? Like just even on the bridge, completely different. So yeah, for me, yes, I love it, and I'm not going to try and give anything away with Picard. Season 3, fingers crossed. I hope we see it again.
Okay.
Urza.
Well, I kind of forget that it's Enterprise E. I want to start by saying that because I'm so focused on the rest of what's going on that I really didn't notice it was all that different from what was on the series or in the prior films. I mean, I knew they blew it up in the last movie, but, just for me, it was a detail that kind of escaped me that this is a whole new Enterprise. I do really like the E. I think it's a gorgeous ship from the outside. I feel like I miss the old Enterprise, but it doesn't take away from this movie. If anything, I think it adds to the mystique of what's next for this gallant crew. Do they get 3 minutes? Who knows? But I have to give it 7 out of 7 warp cores.
Yeah,
I love Generations. I love First Contact. And I love Star Trek 4. Those are my 3 favorite Star Trek films. Any one of them could be my number 1 at any given time. I'm sure I've ranked them number 1. One of them has been my number 1 here, there, or everywhere. The biggest thing that grabs me about this movie is Picard's speech, how he interacts with some random late 21st century human, and how they're paired up for most of the movie, which feels odd. It's kind of like pairing Picard up with a kid. He doesn't like kids,
Yeah.
And this is a person who challenges him and is. I think of it as a conflict that maybe if they had used his character more on DS9, he could have had with Sisko. Somebody who doesn't really like him, is not invested in him, doesn't believe in him, but comes around to him, right? And I thought that was really, for me, this was a Picard movie. As much as this is about Data and him playing Pinocchio and all the other characters getting their screen time, this was Picard's like swan song in a big way. More so than I think Nemesis even tries to be. And I really, really, really appreciated this movie for that reason. The rest of it I loved, and I love Steppenwolf, so of course, Magic Carpet Ride, I was like, hell yes, this is awesome. And I thought that was cool because they didn't really get that moment in Star Trek 4 where they had an opportunity to use some song that was very vogue, and they just like made up some really annoying punk song, which I'm on board.
Oh yeah, that's right.
But I like it. I mean, I have to say there's very little I can find fault with this movie. I mean, I don't. Even the special effects to me hold up pretty well because a lot of them are fairly practical. They weren't really. There wasn't a lot of obviously crappy computer graphics. They were just basic and real. I do wish we got a little bit more Borg Queen and Picard time. A little more Locutus and Picard wrestling with that identity that it's not to spoil anything about Picard, it's totally tied to him forever. And I think it's going to just continue to come up with his character even after Patrick Stewart is no more, comic books will be bringing Locutus and Borg back forever. Just like they keep bringing back Kirk and now Cisco. So I think, again, I think this is the strongest film they've ever made. I would love to see Jonathan Frakes do another big screen Star Trek movie. I'm really hoping that's what happens after Picard 3. I love that they are doing the Marvel thing with Star Trek right now and not telling anybody fuck all. They're like, oh yeah, the doors are open, but are the doors open? I don't know. Maybe we'll do something, maybe we won't. Maybe I'll just go drink beer with Ian McKellen for the rest of the time. Totally, Patrick Stewart has earned it, but love it. I mean, it's just, I gush over this movie. It's so wonderful. I keep getting flashes of every bit about this. If you were any other man, I would kill you where you stand. Like, oh my God. Whew. I mean, the respect. I mean, that is some. Well, we all know he has Klingon balls, Picard. I mean, he does.
Right.
He stood on Kronos and told half the council to fuck themselves. So I mean, it's such a great movie. To our listeners out there who maybe are more recent Star Trek fans that didn't get into Next Generation or DS9 or Voyager, maybe haven't watched all the original films. If you are watching Picard or you're watching Lower Decks or Discovery or Strange New Worlds and you're just getting into the scene, Trekkies are very inviting folks, and I would strongly recommend you start your movie journey with this one. Start with First Contact. I know it's not sequential, but that's where you can really set your benchmark and see what gets close. And I have a sneaking suspicion it'll be 2, 4, 6, 7. With that, any closing thoughts, fellas? Any last words for Star Trek VIII First Contact?
I never wish they did Nemesis. I don't care. That has nothing to do with this, but I just have to say it. Anyway,
we'll clash in 2 weeks. That's fine.
Oh, we will.
In 2 weeks, we'll get there. That'll be episode 10. Star Trek IX is coming up next, Insurrection, and to give a little preview, I think we all appreciate it more than we did when we probably first saw it, and it is definitely an episode on the full screen again, on the big screen again. And I do think that there's a lot to talk about there because, like Star Trek V or 3, it sets up a lot that will come into play down the road for Star Trek, and it has a lot of callbacks, which is fan service, which, look, what's the famous George Carlin line? People don't want to deal with complexity, they'd rather stroke themselves. Come on, that's what Insurrection kind of is. But it's fun, it's an interesting journey, and it reminds me of some Voyager stuff that we'll, I'm sure, talk about. But for now, we will take ourselves out and make it so that you hit that subscribe button, that like button, drop us a comment here on Facebook. We are... Did I say Facebook?
Yeah, you did. What do you do?
Whoa! I heard myself say it. I'm like, wow, am I stupid? Or
no, it's 10:20 at night. That's all. You're fine. Keep going.
My goodness, I need a water break. Holy cow! What's going on in my head, Ball? Ball? Is this Stargate or Star Trek? We're going
on fire right
now. My goodness, y'all. All right, so hit that comment button and tell me how stupid I am. Hit the like button. That was funny. And hit that subscribe button. If you've not yet subscribed to Digital Escape Podcast, you can catch all my gaffes here on the Warp Core Podcast, all of Judge Smales and his other aliases, insights into the film history of the wonderful and glorious world that is Star Trek. And Lord Uther will be bald soon, so that'll be interesting. Thank you all again for your time. We appreciate you. And live long and prosper.
Thank you, friends.
Hey, Digital Escape Podcast fans, Melt Off Podcast fans, and Warp Core Podcast fans. If you're a fan of our shows, please check out DigitalEscapePodcast.com. If you'd like to work with us for any of your advertising needs, reach out to us via our website or hit us up on any of our social medias, YouTube, Facebook, etc. We'd love to work with you to develop an ad for your product, service, or business, and we'd love to have you on our show to talk about it. Thanks again.